Did you know that we all have unconscious bias that has an impact on our thoughts, behaviors, and what we say, and we often don't even realize that it's happening? This is due to our brain's natural tendency of making quick judgments and helping us sort through and filter all the information. And whilst we all have it, it can sometimes be very problematic, especially in a leadership context. So in this video today, I'm going to share with you a bit more about unconscious bias and 5 steps on how you can challenge and overcome your unconscious bias as a leader. This video consists of 3 parts. We're first going to start to understand what is unconscious bias. We're then going to look at why unconscious bias is challenging in a leadership context. And then I will share with you 5 steps on how you can overcome your unconscious bias. So what is unconscious bias? Every day we are exposed to millions and millions bits of data and information. And so our brains have a natural tendency, a natural filter system to help us sort through this information and really just focus on what's important to us at the time. Research suggests that our conscious brain can only process about 40 bits of data at any point in time. But as you can imagine, even just sitting here right now, you will have lots of different pieces of information coming at you just by the things that are in your room right now, for example. So we rely on some automated mechanisms in your brain to really sort through that information and function in this world without being too overwhelmed. And this has developed, of course, based on our survival instincts and survival mechanisms long time ago, when we really had to figure out, is there any danger? Are there dangerous animals around? Or are there people from a different tribe that might be there to harm us? So our brains are wired to quickly determine whether somebody is dangerous or not. So we'll quickly look for features that look familiar or similar for us to make a decision whether we should run or fight, or whether this is someone from our tribe, from our group. Back in the day, as you can imagine, this was probably very helpful because we could then make quick decisions. But nowadays, it can have an impact on how we interact with others, because this unconscious bias can lead us to interacting more positively with people that look and feel and sound similar to us. And we might start to act more standoffish or negatively towards people that are different. So in life and death situations, it's very helpful, but in other situations, it can actually lead us to discriminate against people or harm our relationships. So we judge people within milliseconds just based on their visual features, like what they look like, their skin color, their age, their voice, their clothes. It doesn't always allow us to make the right judgments. Let's now talk about unconscious bias in the leadership context. I want to share with you 4 examples of situations where your unconscious bias could get in the way of making the right decision or discriminating against certain people. It can manifest in various ways. Let's look at hiring and promotions. If we have a natural tendency to look and prefer people that are similar to us, you can imagine that it can have an impact on who we hire for a position and also who we provide with a promotion. Of course, when we have to sort through hundreds of resumes, it can be really hard to figure out why and which resume, which document, which candidate is the best. And so if we're not conscious about it, we might fall back to looking for similarities in maybe educational background or cultural background, for example. And with promotions, we might only provide opportunities to people that feel similar to us because we might trust them a little bit more. And the problem there is that it can lead to a lack of diversity in your team and in your workforce. And it can lead to discrimination and an overall culture of mistrust. You want to be more aware of your bias so that you don't make these decisions blindly and just led by this internal unconscious bias. Scenario number 2, performance evaluation. Your bias, your unconscious bias, can have a direct impact on how you view the performance of your employees. You might rate people from certain groups, backgrounds differently in comparison to one another. This can, of course, also lead to a lot of frustration and confusion within your team. Another area where this might impact is the relationships and communication that you might have. You might be spending more or less time with people based on your internal filters and based on what feels easier for you, based on your unconscious bias. So you might communicate differently to the different team members purely based on visual cues that you might have. And it can have a big impact on team dynamics and collaboration and your overall culture. Your unconscious bias can shape the dimensions and the composition of your team. It will shape how you communicate with one another, how you communicate within your team members, who you promote, who you give exposure to. And so this has a lot of dynamic variables that can have a big impact on the culture in your team. So as you've seen, your unconscious bias can have a big impact on your leadership and how you interact with the people in your team or your stakeholders. So it's important that we start to address and become more aware of our unconscious bias. So here are 5 tips to challenge your unconscious bias in your leadership. Step number 1 is to acknowledge our bias. We all have unconscious bias, and bias is not inherently bad, but we all need to acknowledge that we have these automated patterns and filters in our brain that kind of drive us on autopilot sometimes, and it can have an impact on what we see and the data and information we even look at. So the first step is to acknowledge we have it, because only then we can start to do something about it. And there's no shame to be attached to that because we all have these filters. Our brain needs this to function. So bias is great, but it can have negative impacts. So we got to understand how to unpack this. Step number 2 is to educate ourselves. What are all the different unconscious biases that we might have? So some examples are affinity bias, which is the bias I talked about before that leads us to look for people who are similar to us, might have a similar background, so they feel a bit closer and more familiar to us. Another example is confirmation bias, and this is a bias that leads us to look for information that reconfirms something we already believe or want to believe. So it's a filter that leads us to only look for information and data that proves our point instead of challenges our point and take a step back to have a real neutral look at things. So I invite you to educate yourself and read a bit more about the different types of bias so that you can start to spot it a bit easier. Step number 3 is to start to spot your own bias. Reflect regularly about situations and about whether one of these biases has actually taken control. You can also ask yourself and reflect regularly, do you avoid certain people? Do you talk to some groups of people more than you talk to others? Do you avoid certain events or locations? And just kind of start to look at who are the people that you spend the most time with? Or when you're hiring, who are the people that you tend to invite to come for interviews? Step number 4 is challenge your bias. So once we understood and spotted situations that tend to lead us to make certain decisions based on our unconscious bias, we can kind of start to challenge it a little bit. If we know we have a tendency to hire certain people or to only talk to certain people, we can challenge ourselves and put ourselves in different situations. We can't necessarily challenge our first thought because it's an automated process in our brain, but we can challenge the second. So even if your unconscious bias had led you to make a judgment on a person, like a quick first judgment, you know that we all do that, right? We see a person and we quickly judge them within seconds and we haven't even spoken to them. We can then remind ourselves, hang on brain, let me talk to the person first and actually see who they are and what they have to say. Because often appearances can actually mislead us totally. So challenge your bias, team up with people to get their opinions about a candidate, for example. So start to look for ways to step back and look at something or someone with a bit more distance or get to know them a little bit more. And step number 5 of challenging your unconscious bias is to widen your focus regularly. So we tend to avoid or fear or step away from things that are foreign or unknown to us. This is what our brain then senses as danger, because it's unfamiliar, and so we step away even further. We want to expose ourselves more to different cultures, different people, different backgrounds, different areas of work, different social settings, because the more we can familiarize ourselves with differences, the more normal and natural it will feel, and the less our unconscious bias can lead us to misjudging other people. So get comfortable with the uncomfortable. Go out there, get to know people, learn more about their backgrounds and their cultures, get to know the people and what they can bring, and appreciate the value that they have for the team. Your differences are your advantages, so I invite you to be a little bit more open and challenge yourself. So this was a video about unconscious bias and why it's important for leaders to start to challenge themselves a little bit, and then 5 steps to help you challenge and change your unconscious bias. Let me know if you have any questions in the comments below. Here are a few more videos around unconscious bias that will help you understand and unpack this topic a bit more, and I'm looking forward to seeing you soon.